Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Trade Justice Power Hour about Trump's USMCA deal 6 years later. My name is Arthur Stamoulis. I'm the Executive Director of the Trade Justice Education Fund. I'll be moderating today's discussion. As we get started, I encourage you to please put your name, where you're dialing in from, into the chat. We love seeing just how many people around the country are participating in these discussions. I'm really glad to have you here, so please take a second and do that now. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our two presenters. Um, Before I do that, let me offer a little context for today's briefing. When the Trump administration first took office in 2017, many trade activists believed he was going to immediately withdraw the United States from NAFTA. I've mentioned before how I actually had press materials written up and ready to go, celebrating NAFTA's demise and describing all the next steps needed to start reversing NAFTA's decades of harm to working families. Of course, President Trump didn't withdraw the U.S. from NAFTA the first day he took office. Instead, he spent the better part of 2 years renegotiating NAFTA, which he rebranded as the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Some parts of the USMCA were better than the original NAFTA. Some parts were decidedly worse, but a lot of the text was very much the same. And when Trump signed the USMCA, he didn't say it was largely the same as what we already had, albeit with some meaningful changes in a handful of areas. Instead, Trump said the USMCA was the most important trade deal we've ever made by far. He promised it was going to bring jobs pouring back into the United States and that it would be an especially great victory for our farmers. Well, 6 years later, we now have the data, and by most of the indicators working families care about, we're faring even worse under the USMCA than we were under the original NAFTA. Our two guests today just published the most comprehensive report yet on the actual impacts of the USMCA, including its impacts on our trade balance, on manufacturing jobs, on agriculture, and more. Lori Wallach is the founder and director of Rethink Trade at the American Economic Liberties Project. Lori was there for the original NAFTA fight. She's been a leader in the fair trade movement ever since. She's also a senior advisor to the Trade Justice Education Fund and just one of the trade justice movement's biggest champions. And Katie Hettinga is a policy analyst at Rethink Trade. She has degrees in political science and agricultural economics, and was the driving force behind this new report 6 years later. Rosy USMCA promises meet reality. So Katie and Lori's work is so crucial because, as many of you know, the USMCA is now up for a mandatory 6-year review. Renegotiation of the pact has in fact already begun. Major decisions about the agreement's future are being made right now. Katie and Lori are here to tell us exactly where the USMCA has fallen short of the president's promises, and perhaps more importantly, what sort of changes are needed for trade rules to actually work for working people. So thank you so much for being with us. I think, Lori, you're going to take it away. Welcome. Please get started.
Super. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who's joining. So we're less than 3 months before the first mandatory USMCA review. And part of that July 1, 2026 deadline is also a requirement for the three countries to decide if they're going to extend the agreement for another 16 years or do something else. And some of you are part of the original NAFTA debate. Some of you are part of the USMCA fight. And for folks who are newer, I just want to set a little bit of context before I turn it over to my colleague, Katie, who's going to go through some of the findings, and then I'll go through some of the findings. But basically, it was a long and bumpy process between Trump, one, deciding to renegotiate NAFTA instead of getting out, and the deal that went into effect July 1st, 2020. So first of all, because you're seeing a lot of this in the press, the first time around, Mexico and the US engaged a lot. Canada sat on the side. A deal was originally announced by Trump in October 2018. It did not have sufficient labor enforcement. Did have some improvements, like it got rid of ISDS with Canada and rolled it way back with Mexico. There's some other things that were good, but it had some really bad stuff, as Arthur hinted, such as longer patent monopolies for big pharma to raise medicine prices. And then the Democrats won a majority in the House in November 2018. So then suddenly Speaker Pelosi was Speaker, and she said to Trump, no, we're not doing it this way. The deal that got cut, ironically, which was October, again, right before the election, Canada didn't even join in the talks until August. So a year of it had happened almost solo with the U.S. and Mexico. And it sounds like a little bit of that's happening now in this review process. Then Pelosi comes in, she says, we're not doing it this way. The big pharma stuff has to go. The labor stuff has to be better. And she appointed a committee, and that committee renegotiated with the administration, as Democrats, to basically create the now famous rapid response enforcement system for labor rights, which I'm going to explain how that worked to roll back some of that big pharma stuff. And then a final renegotiated NAFTA passed in 2020 and went into effect July 1, 2020. Now, it passed with a wide bipartisan majority in the House and the Senate, but almost 201, the Democrats were very clear in saying that this was the new floor, that every future agreement had to at least have those kind of labor standards with facility-specific enforcement, which I'm going to explain later, and but that this wasn't the model going forward. And the way it's sort of described is the original project basically took an agreement, NAFTA, moved it from like the bottom rung of job-killing hell and sort of brought it up to the crust. But we were not heading towards heaven. It was still a little hot where we landed. It was just better than the bottom of hell. And one of the things the Democrats all said was, let's see how it works out, because there's a large chance that we're going to have to make more fixes, which gets to one of the improvements. Most past trade agreements just lasted forever. The USMCA goes for 16-year terms, and so it goes away on July 1, 2036, unless the countries decide to extend it. And after 6 years, there's a mandatory review, which is what this July 1 date that's upon us is. And at that date, the countries have to decide. They either can extend it as is for 16 years. If they don't make that deadline, then they go into a cycle of annual reviews for the next 10 years. So they have to at least meet by July 1st each year and look at each other and decide what to do. And option number 3, they can renegotiate it and extend it for however long they want, 16 years, or they can change that provision. And the thing that we're heading towards is the renegotiation. So labor, environmental, family farm, consumer groups, most Democratic members of Congress have, and the administration, frankly, have said this should not be extended as is for 16 years, for another 16 years, for reasons that Katie and I will make clear with this report. But there are a lot of questions about when it's going to get renegotiated, how it's going to get renegotiated, if the real things are going to get fixed. And it certainly was an improvement to set an expiration date, but there's going to be, as Arthur is going to describe, a lot of work that's going to have to go into making sure this review actually is useful. Now, under the statute that implemented USMCA, there was supposed to be, by January 2nd, a comprehensive report about how the first 5 years had gone, and then a written plan about what was going to get fixed. And the administration decided not to do that. They took ambiguity in the statute that said must issue a report to Congress and decide they'd verbally brief them. And so there's a 5-page statement you can see on USTR's website, which was the written down version of the verbal briefing. So we decided to do our own study, given there wasn't going to be one from the government. And that is what we're going to walk you through today. You can see the study, which is at rethinktrade.org, www.rethinktrade.org. It's kind of the only comprehensive study, actually. And it's called 6 Years Later, Rosy USMCA Promises Meet Reality. So what we did is we dug through the debate and we identified the specific outcomes that President Trump promised, or other administration figures. He called USMCA, it certainly was his most significant first-term trade achievement. He called the agreement incredible and the best trade agreement ever. And so we looked at all his promises and then we did the legwork to figure out what the actual outcomes are. In sum, it did not work out as planned. And with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, our analyst, who is the lead author of this report. And before Katie goes into the details of it, I will just advance a notice in advance. I'm going to pop back on to cover two of the legal wonky parts. But what Katie is going to basically give to you is the actual data compared to the promises of what Trump said was going to happen, which was a bunch of, super rosy stuff. So it is my honor to introduce my colleague, Katie Hettinga, and she is the lead author of the report. Katie.
Great. Thank you very much for that intro, Lori, and thank you to Trade Justice for the time to speak and to present this very important work. As Lori mentioned, and let me get my slides here sharing. As Lori mentioned, Trump has called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement over and over a very fundamentally important deal. He has referred to it as the most balanced, the most up-to-date, the most significant trade deal that's made in American history. At various signing ceremonies and celebrations during his first term, Trump said that the deal would deliver on a lot of specific promises, which we have seen have not come to bear based on government data reports. So despite claims that Trump said the deal would create hundreds of thousands of American jobs, including thousands of new jobs in auto manufacturing, despite claims that offshoring would end and U.S. industry would be revitalized, despite claims that the deal will fix our giant trade balance with our neighboring countries. The USMCA simply has not delivered on a lot of the things that Trump said that it would. So as Lori mentioned, she'll speak to some of the more technical and legal terms in the language, but to start with, we can just look at the actual government data outcomes and see that all of those Trump promises have not delivered. So first off, starting with our USMCA partners, Canada and Mexico, our trade deficits have in fact gotten much bigger with both Canada and Mexico. We've had a massive trade deficit with Canada on a bilateral status since at least 1985, and we've had a deficit with Mexico since at least 1995. Under the USMCA, that deficit has gotten much larger for both of these countries. So just comparing 2019, which was the last full year before the USMCA took effect on July 1st, 2020 to 2025, which was the last full year for which we have data and the fifth full year that the USMCA was in operation, the U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada and Mexico has increased by more than a third. A lot of that change has been driven by the Mexico deficit increasing by nearly half. That 47% increase in our deficit with Mexico is making a big difference in our trade balance, both with the region and with the world at large. Looking to our deficits with other major trading partners as well, our U.S. goods trade deficit with China has decreased a lot since 2019. The deficit with just China has decreased by $241 billion, but we're still reliant on imports from other countries. In that same time period, comparing 2019 to 2025, we have imported more than $115 billion more goods from Vietnam and over $108 billion worth of goods from Mexico and Canada. So the imports increasing from countries besides China, that may be reflective of a growing trend in nearshoring or friendshoring. This may be companies that are looking to manufacture goods in countries besides China so that they reduce their China exposure and successfully avoid the high U.S. tariffs on goods coming from China. This gets to issues like rules of origin and possible tariff evasion via the USMCA, which Lori will touch on here in a little bit. The issue is that companies are finding other low-wage venues from which they can source their goods. USMCA has failed to significantly raise Mexican wages in several sectors, including manufacturing. Still today, Mexican manufacturing wages remain slightly higher than in Vietnam, but 40% lower than in China and 88% lower than those in the United States. There have been efforts at the domestic level to raise the Mexican minimum wage. And comparing 2018 to this year, we will see a real minimum wage gain of 154%. But wages have not grown so quickly through collective bargaining, and that was something that USMCA was meant to deliver. Likely related to wages still being low, offshoring has continued under the USMCA. When we're looking to the 2026 review, which will take place this summer, it is absolutely necessary to address non-competitive wages in Mexico so that we can both protect workers' rights there and also ensure that US companies and US workers are not suffering from offshoring in the regional agreement as well. Higher wages would disincentivize offshoring and also strengthen Mexico's domestic market so that there is additional demand for US exports from our neighbors as well. Looking to trade balances in some key manufacturing sectors, because Donald Trump did promise that US industry would be revitalized, and he has said the same thing since he took office again for his second term last year, that US jobs and industry would come roaring back. We wanted to take a look at some of these key sectors, including steel and aluminum, as well as automobiles and aerospace. At yet another USMCA celebration during his first term, Trump said that his deal would help the US reclaim a proud heritage as a manufacturing nation. But based on the trade data, that kind of manufacturing resurgence does not seem to have happened. Looking at metals, which we can see on the slide here, in 2021 and 2022, the US fell into a deficit with Mexico and increased its deficit with Canada in steel and steel articles. But it's since recovered its surplus with Mexico, and it's nearly at a bilateral balance with Canada in steel. Similarly, we have maintained our surplus with Mexico in aluminum. The deficit with Canada and aluminum products widened in those years, 2021 and 22, but has since narrowed. The trade deficit with both Canada and Mexico combined in aluminum remained larger in 2025 than in the 5 years before USMCA took effect. Reaching a regional surplus in steel and steel articles trade in 2025 may be less a result of USMCA than a result of targeted Section 232 tariffs on metals, as well as lower demand for steel products in recent years because of inflation and higher interest rates. So even though there may be some marginal improvement, and even though we are nearing balances or surpluses in these metals subsectors, it's important to note that that is not only due to USMCA. There are other extenuating factors as well. Looking to automobiles and aerospace products as well. The United States hit a trade surplus with Canada in automobiles in 2021, 2022, and 2024. Our trade deficit with Mexico in cars widened from 2020 to 2024 and then narrowed again in 2025. These trends indicate that possibly auto rules of origin covering regional value and labor value content have not promoted more balanced trade in the automobile sector. In aerospace, the United States has maintained a regional trade surplus, but the deficit with Canada has increased in recent years. We have seen that several thousand workers in the aerospace sector were certified as having lost their jobs due to trade with Canada or Mexico in the first 2 years of the USMCA. We could see that through petition filings under the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which is no longer in effect due to congressional authorization lapsing. So we only have data for the first 2 years of USMCA, but there have been several thousand workers affected specifically by trade with our regional USMCA partners. That means that it is important that stronger labor standards and rules of origin are a major discussion in the review and a major priority for the United States to actually deliver change for manufacturing workers and US industry at large. As such, one could also assume from Trump's promises that industrial employment would increase under the USMCA. But as we have seen, this has not happened. When we compare February 2020, which was the last month before COVID-related manufacturing job losses started, to December 2025, the end of last year, manufacturing employment is down by 163,000 jobs. Just in the first year of Trump's second term, comparing February to December 2025, we saw manufacturing employment fall by 91,000. Looking at the preliminary jobs report for last month, March of 2026, there was a slight uptick in manufacturing employment, but still a decrease of 80,000 jobs compared to just a year ago in February 2025. Trump promised specific wins in U.S. auto manufacturing. He told workers that USMCA would create 80,000 new jobs in the auto sector alone. But instead, we have seen, comparing again February 2020 to December 2025, auto manufacturing employment fell by more than 36,000 job positions. After the COVID recovery, manufacturing employment did trend upwards again in 2021 and 2022 and peaked in January 2023, but it has declined since then. It's possible that high interest rates have chilled both investment and manufacturing employment, and there are other factors like the walking back of signature Biden administration industrial policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act that also could have had an impact. In addition, these outcomes of manufacturing employment falling under USMCA are in sharp contrast to Mexican outcomes. Between 2019 and 2024, the Mexican census says that roughly 700,000 manufacturing jobs were added in Mexico. Many of these jobs are probably serving the United States market because most of Mexico's non-oil exports are destined to come to the US market. We know, again, from filings under the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program that over 1 million jobs were certified by the US government as having been lost due to NAFTA before USMCA came into effect. Even though we only have just the first 2 years of petition data for the trade adjustment assistance under USMCA, in that time, there were 249 petitions that named Canada or Mexico specifically that were certified as having caused job losses, and that affected over 41,000 workers. So we can see that the job losses have continued even under Trump's signature deal and the renegotiated NAFTA. Also, as U.S. workers are losing jobs, there's been a big increase in foreign direct investment from the United States into Mexican manufacturing facilities, and manufacturing facilities continue to relocate to Mexico under USMCA. Another area in which Trump promised specific wins was for U.S. agricultural producers. He said that USMCA would grow dairy exports by $315 million. In fact, the dairy exports did increase by over $900 million comparing 2019 and 2025. He also said that poultry exports to Canada would rise by at least 50%, and that metric was nearly hit. Poultry exports increased to Canada by 47%, and he also claimed that egg exports would increase significantly, which they did as well. However, looking at the food trade deficit as a whole, not just at those few specific agricultural subsectors, the food trade deficit increased by 29% from 2019 to 2025, as imports increased much faster than exports. We continue to import significant values of produce from Mexico and wheat from Canada, and that is to be expected. But something that we found that was very interesting in this data is that the United States now has trade deficits in both live cattle and beef from both Mexico and Canada, even though we are the cowboy nation and the world's largest beef producer. Our U.S. regional trade deficit in live cattle decreased in 2025 as there were Mexican imports suspended due to the spread of the screwworm, but the U.S. trade deficit in beef has gotten larger since 2019, even with that in consideration. In relation, the United States Department of Agriculture reports that North American imports specifically comprise a larger share of the beef consumption under the United States under USMCA than during the last years of NAFTA. USDA usually reports that North American imports account for about 6% of U.S. beef consumption, but trade associations representing independent farmers and ranchers like RCAF calculate that the overall imports to the United States account for more than a fifth of U.S. beef consumption. There are issues with the U.S. food supply chain that can't be fixed just by regional trade negotiations, and even though our exports have increased in dairy and poultry and eggs, there is still a major issue with our food imbalance. We've recommended in our report and also in comments officially submitted to USTR about the operation of the USMCA, we recommend that the United States reinstate mandatory country of origin labeling so that consumers can make informed decisions about where their food comes from. In addition, include all stages of food production in food rules of origin, and also change source code related provisions so that farmers have the right to repair their tractors and other modern equipment. I will now pass it back to Lori. Thank you again so much for the time, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna cover a couple more issues, and let me see if I can, as smoothly as Katie did, share my screen. Let's see. All right, I think that's good. So 3 other issues covered in the report that are important to know about. One is an issue Katie mentioned, which is rules of origin. That's a technical trade term for the standards that a product must meet in order for it to get the benefits of a trade agreement. And what we found was, although the USMCA rules of origin were better, stronger, higher, so they required more content from the US, Mexico, and Canada than the NAFTA did, they still weren't sufficient, in part in their own merit, but also the background tariffs of what a company would have to pay if they decided not to meet those rules or the labor standards or the environmental rules was not sufficiently high that made it worth it. So, for instance, relative to the NAFTA, which was a 62% of the value of a car had to come from North America to get NAFTA's treatment, 75% for a car had to come from North America, including a rule called the labor value content, which was new, which is 45% of the value had to be at plants making where the average wage was at least $16 an hour to qualify for duty-free access. So what we found is that because the background tariff for cars in the US is so low, 2.5%, that instead of raising wages or sourcing, in the US, companies just decided that they would not comply with the rules and pay the tariff on the car. So what's interesting is actually the rules of origin compliance dropped after USMCA. It went down to 50%. And that was basically in the middle of 2025. I'm sorry, in the beginning of 2025. But by the time the higher tariffs were put in place as part of Trump 2, compliance went up to 90%. So one of the lessons there is we need to have joint higher external tariffs with the other USMCA partners in the areas where we want to build supply chains. So it's worth the while for the companies to meet the higher labor standards or to meet wage rules that actually work, unlike the ones that were tried out. And the rules of origin need to be yet tighter because only the highest ones are for autos, not for a lot of other areas where, for one reason or another, be it for our health, for national security, for resilience, we'd want to try and build a high wage, high standard North American production capacity. We also found that the labor value content, that rule about the average $16 an hour wage being a part of the domestic content, didn't work. And as Katie said, wages in Mexico in manufacturing remain 40% lower than in China, which is just worth thinking about, 40% lower than in China. So the offshoring, not shockingly, continued. The average Mexican auto wage was $5.70. This is in, cutting edge plants by the big three and the key Korean, European, and Japanese automakers. And a UAW worker, makes a lot more. So the recommendations in this regard are that we need something that's specifically wage floor standards. There need to be specific anti-offshoring rules, and the rules of origin need to be spread across more sectors. Now, one of the things that can help with raising wages, but also proved insufficient to across the board raise wages, was the rapid response mechanism. That was one of the great improvements in the USMCA relative to NAFTA. It's a facility-specific labor enforcement mechanism, first time in a trade agreement. And this proved once and for all that strong enforcement of labor rights can benefit workers. The problem is how you scale it up, so it's not only the workers in the plant subject to the specific cases, but across the economy. So how this worked is, unlike the old enforcement system where a country sues a country and then the country faces trade sanctions, the rapid response mechanism let a specific facility get nailed so that they change their behavior. And it's a three-strike system. So the first run of damage is, potential fines, and you have to basically reverse your violations. The second, if the same company in one of its facilities has a second violation, then it's much higher fines. And the third time, you lose your right to import. You have market access taken away. So this can be a very meaningful, improvement. The problem, and the good news is, there have been 37 cases in the first 5 years of USMCA, targeting 36 facilities. However, a lot of these cases basically never went to the final litigation. Some of them had a course of remediation, which is good because the boss had to change their behaviors. 6 of them did go to panels, but 16 of them resolved during review. And that's not something that even shows up in the USMCA. This study that we did, which is, again, closing the gap, it's basically the only one that is a detailed review. We actually coded all the cases, and our colleague Katie and my colleague Danielle Rangel was the lead author. He litigates these cases, our research director. And what he basically found also is that over time, the cases have gotten to be less impactful. So if you look at the different kinds of things that happen, neutrality statements, reinstatements, etc., how many actual contracts, there were only contracts in a small minority of the cases that actually had workers getting better wages and benefits. And over time, this became less and less. So in the first couple of years, most of the cases led to a new union representing the workers, an independent one, not a company-controlled union, so a real election happened, and new collective bargaining agreements. But then, a couple years in, those outcomes start to diminish. And this is a list of all the cases, and by the last year and a half, there have been no union contracts, which is a really bad outcome. The bosses have figured out how to get around it. The Mexican government has not been super on how they're enforcing. We don't know why a bunch of the petitions have been rejected. We don't know how many ones were filed and why they got rejected. We know how many were filed, but we don't know why ones got rejected. And that secrecy makes it very hard for people to rely on the system. So among the recommendations for improvements, obviously, some very technical ones, tightening up the time, switching around who has what roles, requiring more information, clarifying what that resolved during review means in the system. Bigger picture things are things that we realize are missing, are things like adding a substantive obligation to the agreement, requiring all the countries to actually ensure employers bargain in good faith. That's a part of U.S. law. It's not necessarily being enforced right now, but it's not even part of law in Mexico. Another thing is to have the rules apply to all the countries. Now it's very hard to apply them to the U.S. or Canada, giving Mexico's labor bureau the right to do sanctions, and then also trying to figure out how to separate out the fact-finding from the rest of the process. So I am going to unshare. Let me figure out how to do that. Did I just unshare? Hopefully I just unshared.
I think you're good.
Okay. So the final piece of this, the slides, for whatever reason, are not saved here. So I'm going to just say this to the camera, which is the final thing we reviewed is the digital trade rules. And I had some great slides for this. But the USMCA has the most extreme digital trade rules, which are basically unrelated to trade, but are a bunch of policy constraints that big tech got the Trump administration to put in that weren't in previous US trade agreements. And I'm sad to report that actually these came from the Obama administration. They were in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The fact that all of the activists in the U.S. rose up and made it for Congress to approve the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we didn't get stuck with those dang rules that big tech wanted. You need, for instance, for right to repair policies, to do anti-monopoly enforcement against big tech, do kids online safety policy rules. And since USMCA went into effect, Congress and states have taken action, and I had great slides that showed this. But basically at this point, we are now in a situation where the USMCA constraints, which kind of we were trying to impose at Mexico and Canada, Congress and state legislatures have done things like the U.S. House of Representatives, while Republican controlled, passed a bill called the Data Brokers Bill that bans the external transfer out of the U.S. of U.S. consumers' data to certain countries. That just violates the big tech rule that says governments can't limit where the data goes. Or the US government now requires, when it does cloud computing contracts, it requires that certain data be stored in the US. Totally violates that USMCA rule that says you can't control where data is stored. Or a dozen states have passed right to repair laws. But the USMCA has a rule that says governments can't require information related to details around algorithms or sharing of source code. But like, what is a digital lock? When you basically, go to the junkyard and get the headlights to replace the headlight in your car, and you find a deal, but then you have to still pay $500 at the dealer to have them like connect some gizmo to your car and like reprogram it. Well, the right to repair for cars, for farm equipment, for wheelchairs. Many states have done it for different things. But the bottom line is what you have to do is some kind of source code update typically to make the hardware work. And this particular USMCA rule says you can't do that, but that's what's in a lot of these right to repair laws. So there is also a set of proposals in Congress, a lot of them bipartisan, that are anti-monopoly rules, and that would violate another of those rules. So basically, there's been a big call from many members of Congress to update those digital trade rules, basically to strike a bunch of them. The one limiting the digital updates for right to repair. There's another one that would limit AI oversight. That just needs to go. Some of the other ones, there's one that would lock in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, giving a waiver to all online platforms for any liability relating to their platforms. That just has to go. That is not generally supported in Congress anymore. It's just very outdated. But then in addition, there's some of them that could be fixed if they were much more limited, had been exceptions, etc. So all of those updates are also part of what the letters Congress has sent in, what civil society sent in, saying when you do this review, this is another of the things you need to get rid of those big tech rigged rules. Of course, that's going to be a honking food fight with the administration because they are regularly doing stuff for big tech, sometimes trading away actual manufacturing to help out the big tech oligarchs who have that front row seat in the president's inauguration. So with that, that is the final section of our report, and I will turn it back over to Arthur.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you also to Katie. We really appreciate it. In a second, we're going to open it up to questions and comments. I encourage everyone to please enter any questions you have for our presenters, or a short comment if you want, using Zoom's Q&A feature, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. As you're doing that, I'm going to share an exciting action item for everyone. This May and June, people across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are coming together for cross-border days of solidarity against Trump's rigged trade agenda. We're going to be gathering for cross-border demonstrations along the U.S.-Canada and U.S.-Mexico borders, and also for teach-ins, rallies, and other events in the interiors of our countries. These actions are ahead of the official July 1st USMCA review. And the goal is for people to come together across borders and across issue areas to say enough, that we want our governments to put the interests of people and communities ahead of greedy corporations in these ongoing trade negotiations, that we won't be pitted against one another in a never-ending race to the bottom, and that we recognize that working people in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico actually have a lot of the same interests, including good-paying jobs, higher wages, a healthy environment, and basic human dignity. That we understand this isn't about the US versus Canada versus Mexico, but rather billionaires and massive corporations against us all. These days of solidarity are the largest cross-border mobilization against Trump's rigged trade agenda ever, and we need your help. So our action item this month is to please visit the website daysofsolidarity.org. I believe my colleague Clayton is posting that in the chat right now. When you're on that site, we ask that you please do three things. First, sign up for any actions or events near you. There are actions along the borders in places like Buffalo, New York, El Paso, Texas, Blaine, Washington. There are other actions in places like San Diego and Montreal and Mexico City. More are being added. If you're within driving distance of any one of these actions, please, sign up for it now. There are options to request information about buses and carpools and more, but we need folks to RSVP early so that we can marshal those resources wherever there's the most interest and need. Second, whether you're near an action or not, please also take a moment to sign the petition on the website. It calls on governments in all three countries to ensure that any new or renegotiated trade deal prioritizes the needs of people on the planet, not billionaires and corporations. Those petitions will be delivered to trade negotiators in subsequent actions, and we want to make sure as many people as possible sign on. And then third, please help us spread the word. There are links on the daysofsolidarity.org website for sharing it on various social media platforms and sharing it on Blue Sky or Instagram or Facebook or what have you is a great way to build excitement for the mobilization and to help educate our friends and colleagues that there are fair trade alternatives to the rigged trade models of the past and to Trump's continued smoke and mirrors. So again, please visit the website daysofsolidarity.org. Take those three actions: signing up for events near you, signing the petition, spreading the word. It's a big, big help, and we appreciate each of you who can help us with that. Also, if you represent an organization, there's a link on the site for adding your group as an endorser. That's a huge help too. I encourage you to please do that. And if you want to organize an event yourself in your own community, we'd absolutely love that. Just reach out. We'll make sure to include the event in our cross promotion, and we may be able to help in other ways as well. So these days of solidarity are a huge opportunity to come together, to call out all the hatred and the BS that surrounds us today, and to demand something better from our governments. We need your support on that. All right. With that, let's dig into some questions for Lori. Lori, the first question is, why should we renegotiate the USMCA instead of just withdrawing from it?
So the reason why is if we did it right and we actually put some obligations on the companies, for instance, to pay a decent wage, if we did wage floors, if we had cross-border organizing in sectors, if we basically had the rules of origin that said you have to meet these labor and environmental standards, we had what are the facility-specific enforcement of the environmental rules to stop environmental dumping of toxins, et cetera. If we made a North American high-wage, high-standard agreement, then we would want some of the features that that agreement has. Now, it's obviously a totally opposite thing from the vision of NAFTA, which is to take down all limits on trade and limit governments from protecting people and the environment. But if you put obligations on companies, then you would basically say, if you want to trade in this interesting and lucrative zone, if you want to make stuff that gets a lower tariff access in this zone, here is the floor of decency you have to meet. Here are the things you have to do to, internalize carbon, et cetera. Then you want to actually have external tariffs so that goods that don't meet the higher wages, that don't meet the environmental standards, aren't coming in and squashing the good conduct, the higher wages, basically still, you wouldn't have offshoring to Mexico, you'd have offshoring to wherever those rules weren't working. So you want to reward that by having a system. And you would do that, by the way, if you think about any kind of agreement, like if you wanted to do a critical minerals agreement that actually would improve the standards for the miners, that would make sure the processing was environmentally sound, that would have secure supply chains. You get a bunch of countries together saying, here are the rules for all of these companies. And then if you do it this way, here's a price floor guarantee. And we're not letting in stuff that doesn't meet these standards without some kind of a penalty. It's the same concept as anyone who's worked on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM, where you basically use a tariff to have the stuff that doesn't meet the rules stay out, and you use the rules to basically to raise the standards. So that would be the idea. In the same way, you don't want to have just the US states on their own deciding what the minimum wage is. You want a floor that has to do with the conditions for crossing the border.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I say is we have now over 30 years of history of these bad trade deals, offshoring jobs, causing all sorts of other harms. And the ideal is to get good policies in place to start on doing that. Just getting rid of the deals, unfortunately, won't correct all the problems that we now face because of them.
But can I just
Um,
say one thing?
yeah,
If USMCA doesn't get fixed to that model, it doesn't deserve to be continued. Like it basically, it's got 10 more years before anything happens to it. But I would not support the government saying rubber stamp 16 more years. I would rather have it just get on its 10-year tick down and we continue to build power and demand to get it fixed right. And we wait for a different administration because something, nothing dramatic, it doesn't end if we get past July 1. And it doesn't deserve to be extended for another 16 years as is. But if you just sacked it, yeah, I mean, you will get rid of something if you could never make it better than it is, but it's not going to fix those underlying problems.
absolutely. Um, one of the questions here is that Trump's USMCA deal has clearly failed most American workers and farmers. Is it fair to say the impact in Mexico has been even worse?
Um, I think that the initial impacts in Mexico were extremely dire with respect to rural displacement. And it was a combination of the US of the NAFTA rules and a combination of the very neoliberal Mexican right-wing governments doing things like they had 10 years to phase out the tariffs on corn under NAFTA, and they just did it in 3 years. And so, just enormous numbers of subsistence farmers like immediately got wiped out and then flooded to the border cities to try and find an industrial job because they're a small plot without the floor prices, without the subsidies for gasoline, without the communal tractors, all the stuff that like they just killed, and the tariffs gone, so US corn flooding in. That then brought wages down in those border plants that already were there. We'd already seen offshoring before NAFTA. So then USMCA comes in and it doesn't do a ton to help Mexican working people or farmers. It doesn't fix any of that ag stuff. Some of the specific workers in the plants, so there are tens of thousands of workers, and I see this note that no one could see the slides, which is really sad because there are some very interesting statistics there because there are tens of thousands of Mexican workers who have higher wages because of specific RRM cases, and I have the list of the cases and what the outcomes were. But it hasn't gone across the Mexican economy. And it's the case that the current president and the previous president, AMLO, raised wages across the board. But, relatively speaking, they were so in the hole. And in the industrial sector, relative to, the US, much less even to China, are so low from decades of suppression that it is, while Mexico has gotten a lot more investment, as seen as the low wage platform to basically duty free some things to the US, and it stayed that way under USMCA, the jobs that people are doing are poverty jobs. They're not able to guarantee, a decent place to live, much less a nice place to live. You can be working in a US or German or Japanese modern super duper auto factory making cutting edge cars in a multi-billion-dollar modern plant, and you're getting paid in a way that like you can't really feed your family, you can't have a decent place to live, you can't make school fees. And it's just outrageous. And so it's not that that got worse, but it was so damn outrageous that it didn't get better is a huge failing.
As for the slides, we've shared the link to the report in the chat. We're going to send that to everybody who registered. Should we send your slides around as well? Okay,
Please.
so we'll do that. So everyone, you'll get those probably tomorrow. So another question is, what's the single biggest change to the USMCA that would help working people, and what are the chances Trump actually makes that change? On the last part, I'll say quickly, we got to force him, but Lori.
Yeah, there's no chance unless we make him is the answer. The president has already said, total chicken shit things like, wow, I'll just get out of it. And, the answer back to that, if you have a Republican member of Congress or you have any opportunity to talk to the press, is President Trump actually saying that his amazing, best thing ever, first term trade success is an irredeemable failure? He's a failure. Isn't he going to try and fix it? But the thing that I think is the single most important, there are really two improvements. One is the wages. There has to be some direct something on wages. So yeah, we need the improvements that I was describing for RRM, but that's not going to be scale upable. We need to get wages up dramatically through a rule that directly goes to wages to basically stop to the race to the bottom, to stop more US offshoring, but also to make all that investment in Mexico mean a family supporting job for the workers in Mexico. And that, I think, is the number one and single thing. But the things that are closely related to that are having the external tariffs. So that goods that would undermine the benefit to the companies of being made to pay a decent wage don't basically have them just shut down their Mexican operation and go someplace else. Because background tariffs are so low that unless Mexico, Canada, and the US all, for instance, together raise their tariffs on autos to, I don't know what the right rate is, but it's higher than it sure as heck is now. Unless they all do it together, then those multinational car companies will just go someplace else. And from wherever else they can cheat workers and trash the environment, they'll sell into Mexico, Canada, and the US. So that combination of external tariffs and rules of origin, but with wages, are what could make a huge difference. Now, obviously, one of the things we didn't talk about in detail, I didn't have a slide for it, but right now the environmental rules do not have the facility-specific enforcement. And one of the top demands of Democrats in Congress, of all the organizations, is to start doing that, because that's also a race to the bottom opportunity. It's not just a planetary disaster, a public health disaster, but it's also, as a trade cheating thing, the way they would say it as an economist is you're externalizing costs. You're dumping on toxics on the environment and avoiding actually doing the thing that's the right thing. Again, if you raised all the standards and then you had external tariffs, you would create a demand to behave. And that would be the main reason you'd even want the trade agreement.
Great. Someone asked, should there be a second 1999 Seattle? So obviously a reference to the battle in Seattle against the WTO expansion, the millennial round back in the late 90s, which brought people together across issue areas, across borders, to say no and to rail that. Yes, absolutely, there should be. And these cross-border days of solidarity, might not be exactly the same scale, but I think are a really important step to shine a spotlight on this issue and to demonstrate that we have each other's backs and are fighting together for a better future. Um, Another question, Lori. I mean, there's a number of questions about tariffs. Like, how do Trump's new tariffs impact the trade imbalance? What's the role of tariffs in all this?
So tariffs historically have been a useful tool for trade policy, could be a useful tool for trade policy. Again, if you're for CBAMs, you're for tariffs. If you don't want the, unsafe child labor, forced labor, harvested shrimp coming from Vietnam and a couple of other countries where there have been just horrible investigations of horrible conditions. That's countervailed by tariffs. But like any tool, you have to use it right. And Trump's use of tariffs has been like changing a light bulb with a hammer. So almost every single way you could misuse tariffs as a tool that's been exercised by this administration. So I think that we need to be thinking about how to preserve the strategic use of tariffs, which you use them to keep things that are unfairly made because of labor violations, because of human rights violations, environmental externalities out so that they don't destroy companies in any particular country that are doing the right thing. They're most effective if they are predictable, so you can make plans accordingly. And if they are accompanied by other policies like the Biden administration started to do with the green energy investments, et cetera, but didn't go far enough. And if you do it with partners. So for instance, there are 15, 20 countries that really do have like trade cheating problems, and they have chronic global surpluses. They are overproducing, they're dumping their stuff everywhere. Obviously, China is by far the biggest, but Germany is number two, and Korea and Japan and Taiwan are way up there. And so there's a set of countries who you would want to make stop doing the things you're doing, where sometimes it's currency devaluations to get a trade advantage, sometimes it's suppressing wages. So either by taxation policies or busting unions, sometimes it's suppressing consumption. So lots of layers of taxes that then go from the government into subsidizing production and exports. And then, if that goes on for long enough, as it has under the current trade rules, then we now have countries like Brazil and India and Turkey that have chronic trade deficits like the US. They didn't used to. They were in balance or they exported more, and they're getting deindustrialized, and they now have tariffs against imports from China. So tariffs can be a good tool. However, we need to get the principles right. So if I had my magic wand and we're replacing our global trade system, I would have an intentional system that distributes production, which we need for economic inequality, which we need to stop the monopolization and the political power of a few monopolized production facilities in too few countries, which we need for resilience in this climate crisis era of repetition of supply chains and key things. I would distribute production. I would make sure we had repetitive supply chains in medicines, in communications equipment, in green energy, in transportation, in basic metals you need for infrastructure like iron and steel. And I would do that with the trade rules while also having a floor of decency of strongly facilities enforced labor and environmental standards. I would add anti-monopoly competition policy rules in it, so we distribute the power economically, which helps boost democracy and letting control of people who live with the results over the economy. That kind of a system you could then enforce if you required balanced trade. If countries aren't meeting it, you use tariffs, and you would use external tariffs amongst countries that were following those rules together. So again, it can work. Is what Trump's doing working? No, it's actually been counterproductive. So for instance, just for folks to know the data, again, you can see this at our website, rethinktrade.org. We looked at the whole 2025 set of trade data, and what we found is 88,000 fewer manufacturing jobs overall than in 2024. So directionally wrong. It is true it will take a while before we're increasing jobs, but before you start increasing, you want to stop hemorrhaging. So Trump's promise was new jobs will come roaring in. Instead, we lost more. Or investment in new factory construction went down again from the peak, which was 2023. And it went down this time by about $32 billion. It was not small. So another thing we can look at is we have an increased trade deficit by $62 billion in the manufactured goods deficit. Now you'll hear Trump say, oh, our goods trade deficit went down in 2025. I'm a genius, my tariffs. So friends, the reason that happened is because the whole world panicked and our exports of a good, not a manufactured one, raw gold, bars of gold, which are used like to invest in a storm of economic uncertainty. We had a huge increase in goods exports. Half of it was gold because people were in a panic and wanted to basically. So if you look at that trade balance in goods, yeah, it's better. But the reason why is because the global economy was a rocking shit show and people were running to gold. So if you look at goods that are manufactured goods, again, the deficit got $62 billion worse. And that is what happens when you do on and off tariffs at the wrong targets, not coordinating with your allies. You kill the background programs like, for instance, the green energy programs, and you don't come up with your own industrial policies to promote demand for the goods that you make domestically or investment. And we are unfortunately reaping that.
Wow. Thank you for that, Lori. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this excellent report, which again, we're going to email to everyone who registered online for this webinar. Please keep an eye out for that email tomorrow with Lori and Katie's fantastic report, and also with our requests around the cross-border days of solidarity, which are just a really important mobilization and next step in the fight for trade justice. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks again, Lori. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.